As we enter the extended third act of the NFL offseason, the Seahawks arrow appears to be pointing straight up. After a widely acclaimed draft class, Seattle focuses its attention on developing its young players and plugging the remaining holes in the roster. We're here for a vibes check with one of the GOATs of Seattle sports media, Bob Condotta of the Seattle Times. Let's light him up.
I'm Jackson Bevins, and this is Cigar Thoughts.
Welcome back to the Cigar Lounge. I am Jackson Bevins, and along with my frisky producer, Mike Barwin, this is the Cigar Thoughts podcast. Mike, how are we doing today?
Doing great, Jackson. We're in mid-May, a few weeks removed from the draft. The rookies are suiting up. I have fully crystallized opinions about jersey numbers without ever having seen them touch grass. So, yeah, man, feeling great. How are you?
That's a very important aspect of team building. I agree.
It is.
Man, I'm doing great. It's been 3 weeks since the draft, and while most teams still have plenty of maneuvering to do, the bulk of roster construction's been completed. And we've got the perfect guest to talk about this with, and I can't wait to get his thoughts on how the vibes this year match up with those from previous seasons. But before I do that, I want to remind everyone listening that the official Cigar Thoughts cigars are now available for purchase at cigarthoughtsnfl.com. Direct links to order them will be in the notes on the show page as well, so feel free to click that from whichever platform you're listening to us on. As we announced earlier, the cigars are made from a blend of premier Dominican tobacco leaf that has been aged 13 years and are available to Cigar Thoughts listeners for less than half of their normal MSRP. Do this for yourself because they're excellent stogies, and also do it to help support the show. The delivery is speedy, and we've already received some really impressive feedback from those of y'all who have bought them, so thank you for that. It means the world to us. We've also launched our YouTube channel where you can catch entire episodes as well as video clips from every show. This is one of the best ways you can support Cigar Thoughts, so we're grateful for the few seconds it'll take you to subscribe. Really, really do appreciate that. Now, Mike and I have been looking forward to having today's guest on for a long time. He was one of the very first people I ever followed on Twitter when I joined, and he's been an invaluable resource for Seahawks fans for many years. Joining us in the Cigar Lounge is a man who covers the Seahawks for the Seattle Times and who co-authored the book, If These Walls Could Talk, Stories from the Seattle Seahawks Sidelines, Locker Rooms, and Press Box with Dave Wyman. He is the inimitable Bob Condotta. Bob, thanks for coming in.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me. Well, I guess you guys already made clear you're doing well, so I won't ask how you're doing. But yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man, we're really stoked to have you here. And, you know, the draft is still fresh in everyone's mind, and it has received overwhelmingly positive reviews from most of the national media. We spent, as you have, a lot of time breaking down the individual picks. So I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the feelings among Seahawks decision makers kind of leading up to the draft. You know, Pete Carroll and John Schneider were wielding more firepower this year than in any year since their first in Seattle. And I think the fact that they had the fifth pick thrust them into the middle of the league-wide draft conversation. Now, to many of us, it looked like they really leaned into that process and sort of welcomed the moment. What impression did you get in the time from the combine up until the draft in terms of how they were approaching everything?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they really enjoyed the process. They enjoyed picking that high. We saw the whole QB selfie tour, which, there was definitely some, tongue-in-cheek stuff with those pictures and everything. But I do think they always knew they weren't going to get those top two quarterbacks, and they weren't going to try to, I think, make any major move to do that. So, some of that was in having fun. But I do think they entertained the idea of, well, if something bizarre happens and one of those guys falls there, especially if Anthony Richardson had fallen at 5, I do think they would have had a tougher decision than maybe has been portrayed. But again, once it got to draft time, I think they penciled out he probably wasn't going to be there either. But for sure, yeah, they really enjoyed the process. I think it wasn't just having 5, but having 4 of the top 52, I think really allowed them to just really kind of look at all these guys and realize we've got a lot of options here that we're going to be able to do, and it's not just picking once at 63 or something like that, where you just are spending so much time waiting for guys to come off, and you don't know for sure what you can do or whatever. But I think that allowed them to specifically target some things.
Totally, and I wonder, there's so many permutations when you're that high up in the draft, right? Like your number 5 was kind of a fulcrum pick for a lot of teams. I think we saw in real time the shock of Detroit Lions when Seattle selected Devin Witherspoon, which sounds like he was their guy. And there was nothing indicating that Witherspoon wasn't going to be there at 6. Seattle did a phenomenal job of kind of keeping wraps on their intentions there. But, granted, like I said, they had more firepower in terms of draft capital this year than in years past. But it also felt, just aside from that, like this year certainly, and even the last couple of years, their approach to the draft has been a lot different than in years past. Is that something that you noticed in covering this team?
Well, for sure. The minute they made the Russell Wilson trade, they sort of, I always viewed it as they knew this was a 2-year process with getting obviously 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks in each of those years. They knew they had that. And so last year, when they, knowing we've got these picks next year and with the quarterbacks that might be available, that's why I don't think they ever thought about a quarterback last year. Then it kind of I think that's turned out to be a good thing, because I'm not sure that, I think that their assessment of that quarterback class not being that great, but, the early returns sort of look that way. But I think they all along viewed it as a 2-year thing to use all these picks to really rebuild the roster and in a way that they wanted. And so that's why, we saw them last year attack the tackle positions and cornerback and rush in a little bit. And, some of the things they did there, they really targeted some specific things. And while they will say they weren't going after need, it's obvious that they were trying to do some of both. And they can sort of say they weren't going for need because when you have that many picks in those spots, you can sort of go best player available, but best player available also at a spot that's really going to help us. And, so when they did what they did last year, that allowed them to then this year, be able to do the things they took 2 offensive linemen, but neither were tackles, obviously, because they took tackles last year, so they didn't need to do that again. And the success of last year's class as well, and some of the other things they did, sort of allowed them, I think, this year to do a little more best player available, which is why the Witherspoon pick, which as you rightly point out, they did a nice job of keeping their interest in Witherspoon a little bit on the down low, and they did have everybody in the NFL sort of thinking they were probably going to be the team to take Jalen Carter, and I think they considered that idea at some points in the process. I don't think it was totally off the table at certain points in the process, but once it got to draft day, I think it was. I don't think they were gonna take him at 5 ever, and I think that was a decision they had made going into it. And once the draft came and Witherspoon was there, I think it was a pretty easy call for them. But for sure, that was sort of we felt like this was the best player available at that time in the draft and at a spot that can really help us. And so just the freedom, I think, that they sort of had, the flexibility they had with having hit on so many of the picks last year, allowed them this year to go a little more that way. But again, also having, for the top 52, I think they did have some things they wanted to get done with those picks, especially at, getting a rush in, which they did again with Derek Hall. There were some things like that they knew they wanted to do early on, and it was just a matter of which guy falls to them at which spot to make it make sense.
Yeah. Did you get a sense at all that they were anticipating a trade back or got any offers when they were sitting at 5?
They definitely had some offers, and I think they definitely considered it. As John Schneider said later, there were a couple of guys that they were not going to trade down for. I think 2 of those guys were Will Anderson, and who I think they thought there was some scenarios where maybe that could happen, where he'd be available there, and then Witherspoon was the other. And I think if Witherspoon hadn't been there, I think they would have considered some trade downs, because I think there were a couple other guys they viewed just as highly as those guys, and not Jalen Carter, by the way, and I don't think Terry Wilson was either, but I think there were a couple other guys they really liked that they thought that if those 2 guys weren't going to be there at 5, maybe we could move to 8 or 9 or whatever, and we could get that guy and then get a lot more draft capital. But it's interesting. There was so much talk about that they were going to trade down, but if you look at their history, when they've had really high picks, they've kept them. They kept it in 2010. It took Russell Okung. They kept it last year when they had a top 10 pick. It took Charles Cross. They always sort of, and I don't remember if John said the exact number of guys they had first round grades on this year. It was 14 or 16 or whatever. But I think they really felt like with the 5th pick, we really do want to add an elite talent to the team. And so it wasn't just an idea that maybe we trade down just to accumulate a bunch more 2nd or 3rd round picks. I think they felt like this is a rare opportunity to draft that high and to get a player we feel like could be the best in the NFL or one of the best in the NFL at a really premier position. So I think it was going to take a lot for them to want to trade down, but I do think they thought about it.
Yeah. We, on our last show, we had Doug Farrar on, and he referenced a conversation that he had with Pete Carroll and John Schneider at the Combine. And they had talked about, like, without saying it exactly like this, they realized they'd kind of started to get cute in the post LOB years, right? They had a team full of their starting lineups were set. It was a really difficult starting lineup for any rookie to come in and crack, and, picking late in the 1st round. But, they had a lot of picks that left a lot of us going, why are they using such a high pick on this guy? And a lot of those just didn't pan out. And so I think it's encouraging as a Seahawks fan, and as as someone who's writing about this team and wants to see them be interesting and good, that they've stuck and picked the best player on their board when that guy's been there.
For sure. That's a good point about that. They, like in 2013, 14, 15, some of those years, they had so many good players at spots that you weren't really going to take the best player available if it was a cornerback and have him compete with Richard Sherman or whatever, because he's probably not going to be better than Richard Sherman. He's just going to sit behind Richard Sherman or whatever. So you weren't. So I do think the fact that their roster maybe had a few more needs these last couple of years has made it a little bit easier to sort of meld best player available / a spot that really makes sense for us to take a player, because you didn't have as many. They haven't had as many really all pros on their team and things like that in the last few years, where it's like, yeah, there was no reason to take a middle linebacker for a decade, right? I mean, you weren't going to, you flat out just weren't going to do that because you had Bobby Wagner. You weren't going to take a quarterback because you had Russell Wilson. The fact that we saw sort of that the transition there, I think, has made it a little bit easier, or has maybe opened their draft board up a little wider to positions where they would want to take guys. So, I think that was some of the issue with a few of those years where they felt like, yeah, okay, the best player available might be this guy. It might be a middle linebacker, but why would we do that and just have him kind of compete with Bobby Wagner when we just signed Bobby Wagner to a huge contract or whatever. So I think it kind of compelled them a little bit to maybe reach for some guys at some spots. They had, I think maybe they would admit that they had so much success sort of taking what were perceived as some gambles in the middle rounds on some guys like Sherman and Cam Chancellor, and guys that were perceived as kind of not necessarily risk, but just guys who would fall into those spots because people weren't sure. And I think they kept wanting to kind of replicate that a little bit. Like, I think there were some guys they took that were like, we see something out of this guy that nobody else sees, and that worked before for us, but that can be a little bit hard to keep doing. And so I do think they've refined it a little bit the last few years, where they've really taken a lot of guys who've had really significant college production. And so, a lot of guys who do come here with, really kind of proven backgrounds of having had success. I think, you saw that last year with, guys like Ken Walker and, Charles Cross, obviously, Abraham Lucas had a great career at Washington State. I mean, guys who had done a lot. And so you at least had a real background to go on there.
The Seahawks have taken a lot of heat for trading first round picks for, more established players over the last, I guess, 10 years now. And I wonder, just as we're talking about it, how much having a roster that is so difficult for a rookie to crack played into the decisions to trade for top tier talents like Percy Harvin, Jimmy Graham, Jamal Adams, even if the integration of those players into the team didn't go as planned. Do you think that was just more of like, hey, these are positions where, we don't need a ton of depth right now. We want to fill out this one last spot with this top end type of talent. And, we're willing to risk those first round picks just to put the last piece in the puzzle.
For sure. I mean, I mean, obviously the Percy Harvin trade is among the most notable of those. And I think that was just a thing that coming off that 2012 season, they felt like, man, if we can add a really elite playmaker, I think they felt like at that time the defense was pretty much set. And, you had a quarterback, you had a running back in Marshawn and things like that. The whole thing that the receiver core was pedestrian, was regarded as pedestrian at the time. I mean, that was part of what led to Harvin, was I think they just felt like, man, this guy could be, just such an elite talent if we can fit him in here, and maybe we don't have to lean on him quite as much as Minnesota had or whatever. If we can just kind of fit him in different ways, he can really do that for us. And then, the Jimmy Graham trade, I still think some of that was a reaction to what had happened in the Super Bowl, where, it got to that point, and because of some injury situations that they'd had and things like that going into that game, when you're throwing to Ricardo Lockett in one of the key plays in franchise history, I think they felt like, well, if we can add, a guy like Jimmy Graham to that, if we ever have a situation like that again, that's one of we'd rather be throwing to a guy like Jimmy Graham maybe than what's our third or fourth receiver or whatever. So I think there were some really specific things that played into that. But the story they always told on the Graham trade too was that just kind of came out of the blue. New Orleans was having issues with Graham and his contract, and he sort of wanted out, and so he suddenly became available, and they just kind of took a flyer on it as well, given everything that had happened. So I don't know how much of that was necessarily like a stated philosophy or a thought to do that, as much as just some individual things that kind of crept up and just some situations they thought they could take advantage of. But for sure, in those years, having, what were late round, first round picks as well, I mean, that was always part of the deal, was they felt like, what the Graham year was, they would have picked 31st, right? So they gave up the 31st pick, and are we going to be able to get a player as good as Jimmy Graham with the 31st pick? And obviously they packaged Max Unger as part of that as well. So it wasn't just the one for one there, but that was sort of the thought, was Jimmy Graham's a potential, that's not a guy, you may not be getting that with the 31st pick.
So with the draft in the rear view, the rookies took to the VMAC over the past several days for minicamp. What did you notice? What stood out the most to you during those practices?
Yeah, a couple of caveats. So they don't do as much on the field necessarily with the rookie minicamp as they used to, because of the way the rules kind of changed a few years ago, where all these guys now can be part of OTAs. Used to be the rookie minicamp was a much bigger deal in terms of wanting to try to see them, because a lot of these guys weren't going to be able to participate in OTAs. They weren't going to see them again for a month, so they would really want to have a pretty intensive on-field thing. Now, now it's a little, we just saw two sort of 90-minute practices that were not super intense necessarily. So it's a little bit harder to read some of that out of it. And then, the kind of somewhat disappointing thing is we didn't really see the top two picks do a whole lot either, because they limited those guys because they kind of have some hamstring issues. And again, the fact that these guys now just immediately go straight into OTAs instead of having to sit out and maybe you don't see them again until mandatory minicamp or whatever, plays into that being cautious too. So, we get to see an open OTA next Monday, and so that'll be fun to see. Interesting to see if those guys are kind of back out there and doing a little bit more and being able to read more of that. The couple of things that really stood out were, just sort of the size of both Mike Morris and Cameron Young, and that each of them are Mike Morris, he does look the part. All the talk about he had dropped down to 275 at the combine, and the Seahawks wanted him to get bigger and be kind of a 3-5 technique defensive end, a guy with his hand in the ground instead of an edge rusher. He definitely looked that. I mean, he was an impressive looking guy, just kind of seeing him out there. And then Cameron Young, the same thing. That's the nose tackle spot, which can be kind of a really subtle position maybe, but they've always liked to have that big 330-pound guy in the middle. And with Brian Monet's health situation and cutting Al Woods, they really kind of had a lack of that. So Cameron Young, that was definitely a targeted pick for them to try to get a big guy who they felt like could be that. And he was listed at 304, but weighed 320, and he definitely looked the part out there as well. So that's probably the two of the most important picks they made, and they each are sort of mid-round picks. So it's maybe it's kind of weird to say that, I guess, but they are going to need each of those guys to right now, with the team is currently constructed anyway, they're going to need each of those guys to play significant roles. So the fact that they sort of looked physically much more kind of capable of being the kind of player that the Seahawks want at those spots was probably the most noteworthy thing. It was also, it was interesting hearing Pete Carroll just when we're talking about Jackson Smith and Jigba and how, they really view him as a slot guy, and that's basically where he played at Ohio State. But sometimes we hear them when they talk about receivers that they're going to line up everywhere or whatever, but they really seem to make it clear that starting out, that's where they really want him to be, and kind of allow DK and Tyler Lockett to play more on the outside and really feel like that could be a really good receiving trio for him with and especially in Smith and Jigba's case, maybe a more defined role coming in than I don't know that they'd always want to confine him to that, to just largely playing the slot. But I think to start out, I think they want to do that. So, from something Pete said, that really stood out to me as well.
I'm glad you mentioned JSN, because he's the one guy that I really had my heart set on after pick 5. And I thought it'd be pretty surprising for him to still be there at 20. To not have a receiver go in the first 19 picks in a modern NFL draft is super rare. And I think that I like Jordan Addison, I like Zay Flowers, I think Quentin Johnston's interesting. There's a couple guys later who I think could be productive. But to me, there was a standalone tier of wide receiver occupied by one man. And for Seattle to have taken him, I thought was so encouraging, because teams that make the Super Bowl have great pass catchers, and Tyler Lockett has been awesome. Adding a third receiver is a rare luxury, but I think it also provides some real security for this team when it comes to the twilight of Tyler Lockett's time in Seattle here over the next couple of years. So I was really, really pleased with that. The one guy that I was super curious to see how he looked in rookie camp, and granted, I understand how limited the activities are there, but Derek Hall is such an intriguing player to me. That combination, not only of speed, there's lots of kind of lighter stand-up defensive edge guys who have a lot of speed, but his ability to transfer that speed into power seems to make him a little bit less one-dimensional. Did you get a chance to see much of him at all?
Yeah. Again, especially for the line, it can be, other than just kind of looking at what they look like, it's hard to read too much, because, they're not in pads and they're not doing a whole, so much of what we see is just kind of individual drills. They're just kind of going through things. But for sure, he's another guy, when you just look at him, he does look the part. Again, I would say that that's the thing about both these last two draft classes, is the first impression of all of these guys is a lot more that they do sort of look the part. And that can be such a cliche this time of year. I was joking with somebody that I felt like I saw 115 different tweets about rookie guys at NFL beat writers saying so-and-so looks the part, at first impression. But, going back to some of the previous draft classes that they've had that you were referencing earlier, though, I do feel like there's been some other years when you sort of looked at it, that some of the guys, and maybe you didn't necessarily feel that, but with this draft class you certainly did, with guys like Hall and Mike Morris and all three of the defensive linemen they took, really kind of looking that way. Anthony Bradford too. I thought he just sort of looked that way as well.
Yeah, this team definitely gets off the bus again.
Yeah,
that was kind of the thing about that 2012 to 2015. Team was intimidating getting off the bus, and I think they'd kind of moved away from that a little bit, but they got some studs on this roster now, guys that if they were to walk in a room, you'd be like, that's an NFL player.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would agree with you wholeheartedly on that. This is a team that, like last year, both Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas, first time you saw him, you're like, man, not that you didn't know they're not big guys or whatever, but, sometimes you see the guys on, especially in the case of like Cross, I won't admit that I watched a ton of Mississippi State games, those couple of years, so I had a little bit of a more limited knowledge of him, and when you saw him out there the first time, you were just like, yeah, this guy looks like an NFL left tackle, the same way that, you definitely felt that when you saw a lot of those guys in that, as you referenced, in that kind of 2010-11 era.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you mentioned Morris and Young, and we got a chance to talk about Hall a little bit, because Seattle did start to address the trenches a little bit later in the draft, but I think even those additions left something to be desired in the minds of a lot of fans. And as you and I know, there are still some cap gymnastics to be done. They've already done some of that with Tyler Lockett's contract. There's a fair amount of unsigned talent still out there. What sense do you get regarding how hard Seattle will be pursuing interior O-line and D-line talent between now and the beginning of the season?
Yeah, I'm not sure I anticipate a real major move. I know you can look at the contracts of a guy like Jamal Adams or something like that and be like, if they could restructure that, they could open up a lot of money. I don't know that they want to do that a lot, and I don't sense there's anything they're going to do now. What I do think they'll do is try to get through minicamp and maybe into early training camp and see, really get a sense of what they feel like they have, how ready these guys really are to contribute significantly, and then kind of go the waiver wire type. Is there a veteran out there we could trade for type thing? As you mentioned, there are some guys that are still available. I think probably a lot of some of those guys would still be available into training camp or right before training camp starts. That's sort of more what I see them trying to do is sort of a 1 year, for not much more than the veteran minimum kind of thing. I don't know that I see anything really significant. Obviously, they are really up against the cap. They've always been a team that's been careful about trying to not spend too much money into the future, and they have done a couple of things. The Lockett thing in particular that has pushed some money out. But I think and obviously they did sign some guys to some big contracts, obviously, over the last few years with Jamal and DK Metcalf as well. And, they have done some things like that do have them spend some money into the future for some guys. But I don't know that if I see them really trying to, I think they would save anything, long-winded way of saying, I don't see anything right now. Yeah. I kind of feel like they try to get into training camp and see what becomes available then and kind of go more that route.
Totally. And I mean, we still got post June 1st cuts and all kinds of things that happen on the NFL calendar in terms of roster construction and all of that. The one last guy I want to mention before we move on from that is Shelby Harris, who I thought played really well coming over from Denver last year. I wasn't stunned that they cut him. I was a little surprised. I'm also a little surprised that he's still out there. I'm not even sure he's been taking any visits. Is there any conversations happening there that you're aware of?
I don't know that there's active conversations, but I do know they left the door open for his return. So I do know it's sort of more that. So, I don't know if it's one of those things where if Shelby does talk to somebody else, Seattle will be like, hey, make sure you call us first. And we'll see if we can match that or whatever. But yeah, when they cut him, I know for sure there was they told him that we feel like we have to make this move now, but we'd be more than open to bringing you back at some point at obviously a lesser deal than he was getting, and so that's always the tough part for the players is having to try to accept that, and maybe he just wants to not have to work during an off-season program, and he'll just wait and see until training camp to see if something comes available then. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all if he came back. It wouldn't surprise me if he didn't. But I do think that door's been left open there. I think it was for Al Woods as well. I think they were leaving the door open there. But I think Al got an offer, and there are obviously always feelings involved when you do get cut by a team. So yeah. Players do, there is sort of the massaging that of a player coming back on kind of a lesser deal. So, I don't think it's quite as easy sometimes.
It's easy to forget how human the NFL is.
Yeah, for sure. And they're guys, and guys who are professional athletes typically have, they kind of have a lot of them, the kind of the ego that's there or whatever. And, that's the kind of thing that played into, say, like when Russell Okung left, everybody was like, why didn't the Seahawks just give him that offer? But Russell Okung didn't necessarily want to accept an offer like that from the team he'd just been with, but it's a lot easier to accept an offer like that from a new team, when sure. You feel like, okay, I'm just going to walk away from that team. But, returning to the same locker room, but maybe on kind of a lesser contract than you had or that you wanted to get, and having to answer those questions from, the media and just kind of having that be part of the narrative the whole time. It's something a lot of times not only does the player not want, but the organization doesn't want either. But I think they would leave the door open for Shelby. But and that's where, again, if Mike Morris really shows he can do that, and then obviously they signed Mario Edwards as well. So they have signed a guy there that can kind of sort of do what Shelby did. So
does he look the part though?
Yeah. Is he showing up to camp in the best shape of his life?
Yeah. So the first time we'll see Mario is next Monday, and I would imagine maybe they'll make him available to the media then. He obviously just signed this Monday, so maybe that precludes bringing back Shelby, or especially if they really see if they feel like they're comfortable there with what they have there. And I know Mario Edwards probably isn't the sexy signing people wanted, but I think in their eyes, I think it's a significant one. And so I think when they did talk about, after the draft, when they said, yeah, we still have some moves to do on the defensive line, I think that was something because they had, he'd come in for the visit in March. I think they were in contact with him all along. So I think that was sort of the move they were foreshadowing there all along when they made some of those comments.
Sure. That makes sense. And one thing you brought up a little while ago that I appreciated was after the Russell Wilson trade, Carroll and Schneider really understanding this is a 2-year process. And I think most of the national media looked at Seattle after that and said, this is a full-on rebuild, but they've actually done a really beautiful job of straddling the line between getting younger and staying competitive. And then this past year, they outperformed most expectations. Given the fact that they won 9 games, they made the playoffs, they are still so young. Does it feel like go time now? Like now the expectations are make a deep playoff run, be championship contender?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Pete turns 72 in September, so he doesn't have a lot of time to necessarily rebuild. Not that I think he's thinking of retiring or anything like that, but I think the future is definitely now with this team and this group. And I think to John, I think what happened last year, John Schneider, I think it validated a little bit his overall philosophy. He always talks about building a consistent championship caliber team and having a roster that isn't going to have huge dips. And I think that he feels like we did that. Like we traded away, we traded away a franchise quarterback, and we didn't take a huge dip. And I think to him, it totally validated their overall philosophy on how they put the teams together. And then winning the 9 games last year, and obviously this was still kind of a flawed team last year. I mean, they really just got blown out 3 times by the 49ers. So there was definitely a talent gap there that needs to be closed between them and the 49ers, and I think they hope they've done that. And then obviously San Francisco's got kind of a goofy quarterback situation too, so which plays into it. The Seahawks feel a lot more comfortable about theirs heading into this year now. But yeah, for sure. I don't think there's any question at all that it is. But again, I also don't feel like, I think that's where people feel like, oh, you should just go ahead and restructure all these contracts and push out $50 million in cap space to 2025 or whatever to try to win now. And I think what they did last year, I think to John further validates this isn't why you do that, because it's the teams that push money out forever that then have that inevitable, wow, we have $60 million in dead cap money and we can't do anything this year, and we're probably not going to be that good in this specific year or whatever. I think that's why they've always tried to resist that as much as they can. And like I say, I feel like what they did last year, I think in their eyes sort of validates their overall philosophy that what they've always sort of tried to stick to does work.
Yeah. And it's sound process. We've seen teams kick the credit card debt down the road. And then at some point, if you don't capitalize on that, even if you do, you're left in a pretty rough situation. You don't have to look any further than the Saints, who did that like 5 years in a row, the Rams, who did that for 5 years in a row. And, they've got long uphill battles now to face. The Rams were able to cash in on it, and I'm sure everyone involved would say it was worth it because of that. But it's a huge gamble because the way the NFL salary cap is structured, it can be a long, slow haul back to the top when you've done that, especially when you're trading away a lot of your top picks. Bob, I want to ask you to hop in the time machine with me here for just a second. It was about 14 months ago that Seattle did pull off the biggest trade in franchise history. They moved Russell Wilson. It was the dominant storyline of last offseason. Now, 1 year ago, Seattle was just coming off of their first post-Russell Wilson draft. What were your expectations of the team at this time last year? And now that you can look back at that, what was the biggest difference between reality and expectation for you?
Well, I can at least say I went on record. I had to make a prediction for the Seattle Times. I picked them to go 7-10. So I didn't feel it was going to be a total bottoming out thing, because I did feel like they had a little bit more. I felt like the foundation was a little bit sounder than maybe a lot of people did. The people who were picking them to win 3 or 4 games or whatever, I felt like they just had some overall talent. And if Geno Smith, which was always the wild card, obviously, was if Geno Smith could play to a certain level, that be what would really avoid them kind of having any big drop off. But I didn't necessarily envision a playoff berth and winning 9 games, and especially winning some of the games that they did early in the year. I can't say I saw all that, but I never felt like it was going to be that complete bottoming out, because I did just feel like there was an overall foundation here that I thought was a little stronger than maybe people felt. Having 2 really good receivers, and at that time I remember assuming that the tackles are going to be okay and that their offensive line might be a little better than it had been. And at that time, the surprising negative last year was obviously that the defensive front 7 sort of struggled the way it did. But this time a year ago, they were coming off. They had allowed the second fewest rushing yards in the NFL and things like that, and they had most of that crew back. So you sort of felt like the defense would still play to a fairly decent level. And that's what, and that with the moves they'd made last year in the secondary, seemed like those might be good moves. And then I sort of was under the assumption as well that Jamal Adams would come back fully healthy and be able to play well. So that was some of what the thought process that led me to think they weren't going to completely bottom out, and not all those things happened. And, they sort of got a much better year out of Geno than I think anybody thought. And some of the things on defense didn't work out. And that's why they ended up kind of being a 500 team again. But it did sort of show that the overall base was maybe not as bad as everybody had thought. But I never bought into the idea that they thought that they were like, yeah, let's just rebuild. And in some ways that's hard to do in the NFL. You can't really tank necessarily in the NFL, the way you can in other sports. I mean, it's harder to just like not spend your money or just get rid of everybody or whatever. People would have to want these guys or something like that. I mean, you can't necessarily just always trade everybody for high pay.
Exactly. You can take in the NBA and get one transformative player at the top of the next year's draft and you're right back in it. But with 53 roster spots and, basketball, just to continue that comparison, is becoming more and more of a positionless sport. It's not the case in the NFL. Like, you have very specific roles and a lot of them that have to get filled. And I think that's what gets lost in the rebuild conversation is you don't want to go creating a bunch of extra holes in your roster to then go and try and fill. For sure. Yeah. And I really don't think that was ever really the thought process. I don't even think, they traded Russell, as we all know. I think the trading of Russell is even more nuanced than, maybe even we really realized, but certainly than nationally realized. I think there were just a lot of people who thought, well, they traded their quarterback, they were just committing to a long rebuild. But, they didn't want to trade Russell Wilson. They weren't ever looking at it like, yeah, we just want to trade Russell and rebuild. It was, sort of the complications of the relationship with Russell and them feeling like, he wasn't going to sign another contract with them. And this was the time to trade him because he had 2 years left on his deal. So that was the time to get a lot for him. You weren't going to get, if he'd come back last year and if he'd have struggled at all, and if they tried to trade him this offseason, they weren't going to get anywhere close to the package they got from Denver. And so, when they got what they did from Denver, with Russell being the age he was and Russell making clear he wanted out and wasn't going to resign, and the 2022 season was probably just going to be kind of an ugly, drama-filled thing if they'd have kept Russell, with nothing but constant talk about his future, which they were already tired of during the 2021 season when, I think they felt like every game in 2021 was being viewed as this indictment on or a sort of a referendum on how they're using Russell, and is Russell going to be back, and are they letting Russ cook and all that. They were just tired of all that. So it was much more all that than it was some organizational decision that we're just going to rebuild and start over from the ground up. Man, I was tired of it, and it wasn't my job on the line. Yeah. To that end, did you feel like there was an energy shift in the building after that trade?
For sure. And, and again, and it's easy to just turn everything into Russell bashing or whatever. But, I think there's people who in the organization who feel bad that it sort of has become that a little bit, because Russell is a very important player in the history of this franchise. And he did, he's the quarterback of the only team that won a Super Bowl. So I don't think anybody was necessarily happy that it ended the way it did. But for sure, once it was over, I think there was a little bit of a sigh of relief of like, okay, we're moving on now. And, this was a relationship that sort of had to end, being able to put that aside, again, I think everybody was getting tired of sort of the just what was going on around Russell and that feeling. I don't know if it got so much to that they were worrying about, God, if we don't call a pass here, is this going to be something everybody's gonna dissect to the minute degree? Are you letting Russ do what he wants here, or are you just calling the best play for the team? But I think there was a little bit of last year of, okay, you could just go back to, it's just sort of a team again, as opposed to, everything being sort of centered on one guy and so many questions about one guy. And for sure, you notice that. I think Pete Carroll is, he's been pretty frank about, his USC days. That's what he got used to was, every couple of years, the roster sort of turns over. It's a fresh set of personalities. It's sort of the newness of, these aren't guys who are bored with my message or whatever, I can talk about this stuff and it's all fresh to them, and they are maybe much more receptive to it and all that. And so I definitely think Pete really thrived on that challenge of and I think John did too, of can you sort of create a new roster that can be really successful. And obviously it wasn't completely new because they had a lot of, they did have a lot of high caliber guys coming back with, the Quandre and Jamal Adams and Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf. I mean, it was not a roster that was bereft of kind of high, elite talent and strong personalities and guys who'd been around for a little while. But they definitely, I think, felt, they liked the idea of the leadership, I think, kind of turning over and Pete being able to sort of just mold a new team out of all of that.
Yeah. To me, the clearest indication that it wasn't going to be a teardown was when Quandre Diggs was the first free agent to re-sign, because he's someone entering the second half of his career, is very established. If he wanted to go ring chasing, he would have had, some opportunities to do that. And he signed. I think that really sent a message to the team, at least from my perspective, that like, hey, this is not some big 3-year wasteland that we're entering. Like we're still ready to go. And you talked about the defense a little while ago, and I want to hone in on that for a second, because there was a lot of discussion surrounding the Seahawks defensive scheme switch and their struggles to find consistency on that side of the ball last year. But given the addition of players like Dre'Mont Jones, Derek Hall, Devin Witherspoon, you got the returns of Bobby Wagner, Jaron Reed, Jamal Adams. What are you expecting to see in 2023, both from like a scheme standpoint, but also the personality of this defense?
Yeah, and that's, I think saying personality of the defense, I think is a real key thing, because I think they felt like that's probably what was missing a little bit last year, was because they did sort of switch the scheme a little bit. I think they feel like that's overplayed a little bit. It wasn't like they totally threw it all out. They were asking some guys to do some different things like Puna Ford, but a lot of guys were being the roles weren't necessarily switching that much. But they obviously had such a kind of clearly defined personality for so many years there, and I do think like just with the turnover of the lineup, Bobby last year, KJ Wright the year before, who were really strong kind of leaders who had been around for a long time and sort of were links to all of that. And last year was the first time you really had none of that there, and so I do think that there was. And then when you lose Jamal Adams, in the first half of the first game, and he was the guy I think they really felt like could create a lot of that personality for the defense, and he wasn't there to do that. So yeah, I think I think what they're hoping to do this year is that with the guys who are coming back, they can more clearly kind of refine what they're good at and fit it into what they're doing. And then with the guys they've added, and it's interesting when you mention like 5 guys there, and obviously they've lost a few guys, so it's not completely just adding. But when you mention all of that, that's like 5 or 6. If you kind of include Jamal Adams in there, since he really didn't play last year, that's 5 or 6 pretty good players that you're adding to this defense. And then if a couple of those rookies pay off, aside from Witherspoon, but if a couple of the other rookies pay off, that's 6 or 7 kind of new guys who could really create a new personality for this defense. And I think that's what they're hoping can happen this year.
Yeah. And I'm glad we talked about the personality and leadership a little bit, because you've been around this team for a long time and you've seen a lot of the ins and outs that have led to the various successes and failures over the years. Given that it's still only May, how does this team in this moment compare to teams of the past, just kind of from a vibes perspective?
Well, I think the vibe is very, very positive. I think everybody is very enthusiastic and excited about where the overall team is going. I still don't know. I took over. It's been basically exactly 10 years now. I took over in May of 2013. The first thing I ever covered was the rookie minicamp in 2013. I didn't cover the draft then. We hadn't made that change yet. But I don't feel like this is necessarily back to that 2012 thing. To me, when I remember taking over, and I almost just felt like the Super Bowl was preordained. Like I almost never doubted at all that team was going to end up in the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
It just seemed like they were so good,
right,
and had such a confidence about them that it just felt like nobody, they just never questioned at all that was sort of going to be the fate of that team, was to get to the Super Bowl and probably win it. And just with the elite talent that they had everywhere, I don't feel like this team is back to that yet. I think there's a few more question marks with this team, and things like, what is the defensive leadership in a way going to be? We saw the captains last year with Quandre Diggs and Al Woods, and obviously Al Woods isn't around anymore. And now you bring back Bobby Wagner, and sort of how does that all, what is that mix all going to be, and how do they work that in, and reintegrating Jamal Adams into everything, which, he's the highest paid player on the team. So, they are hoping for sure that Jamal is going to be a really significant part of everything once he comes back, and getting Jordan Brooks hopefully back into that at some point too, for first round pick, pretty big investment there as well. So from that standpoint, I feel like there's more question marks about this team than in 2012. Pete's tried to make that Pete has made that comparison a few times about feeling like last year felt pretty similar to the end of 2012. But that team had gone on the road and won a playoff game, and gone on the road and really should have probably won another one. So and ended up in the NFC title game. So I don't feel like they're quite back to that yet. But in terms of the enthusiasm and everything from this team, I feel like everybody feels like they've totally turned the page on the Russell trade, and there's no more talk of how are you going to survive in the post Russell Wilson era. I think they feel like they've begun to show how they're going to do that, and now it's just taking that next step to go from okay, we survived all that, now it's thriving and all that, and it's becoming a legit player in the NFC again. And luckily the NFC looks, who's the dominant teams in the NFC. I mean, Philadelphia obviously looks really good, but they lost a lot on defense. The 49ers sort of have their quarterback situation sort of is up in the air. And then there's not a lot of other teams you look at that you feel like aren't teams Seattle could compete with. So, I think they really do feel like they've got an opportunity to do a lot this year.
Yeah. When you joined the beat in 2013, that locker room was brimming with massive personalities, right? I mean, you had Richard Sherman and Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor and Michael Bennett and Bobby Wagner and Marshawn Lynch and Doug Baldwin. I mean, these are needle movers, right? That must have been a very boisterous locker room. And I'm sure that there was a distinct hierarchy in terms of the voices in that locker room, but all of those guys are gone, Russell Wilson, of course, too. And with the exception of Bobby Wagner, who's back now. As you've covered this team over the last 2-3 years, who have you really seen step up and take those leadership roles in the locker room in the absence of those Hall of Famers and all pros that have moved on?
Yeah, the two obvious guys are Quandre Diggs and then Geno Smith. And, obviously with Geno, you sort of have to prove it on the field first before you can be that leader. I mean, quarterbacks inevitably are sort of huge
but
leaders.
He was well loved before that, right?
He was, for sure. Yeah, he was very well liked. And that's why once he, only a game or two into it, once he sort of showed that, once he won the job and then showed he deserved to have won the job with the way he played, especially, I always really felt like the Detroit game last year was a huge turning point in that, just the way he played in that game, and that, they were able to pull that game off on the road, and kind of rebound, after the San Francisco game. People were like, God, you got to bench Geno, or, when you're going to play Drew Lock, or kind of reopen the quarterback competition or whatever. And after that Detroit game, I felt like, not only was it the fact that Geno was very well liked, but at that point it became he is the leader in every way, on the field and off the field, and he really became that guy. And then defensively, obviously, was a little trickier, but Quandre Diggs is kind of the guy who really fits that bill in a lot of ways, both in what his role is on the field and how productive he's been, and then also just kind of having that personality to be a leader like that. But for sure, they need that needs to come through a little bit more on the defense. And like I said, it'll be interesting to see with Bobby and kind of how that goes, and to see kind of revert back to kind of being that guy, or they kind of reintegrating some of the younger guys into that as well, which I think is what the team wants. I think they sort of hope that some of the younger guys on defense can evolve into that as well.
Yeah. There's a couple of other guys I want to ask about specifically, and just kind of their role in the locker room and kind of within that hierarchy of leadership. One of which was a superstar almost from day one, and he seems to have kind of welcomed that, but is also taking on a little bit more mature role within the team, that being DK Metcalf. And then the other guy that I'm really interested in is Jordan Brooks, another young guy who's drafted very high, potentially as an heir apparent to Bobby Wagner. What kind of roles do those two guys have in that locker room?
Well, and the team really wanted them to take much more of that kind of role last year, especially DK when he signed the extension, right? I mean, when he gets that, he becomes one of the faces of the franchise. You saw the Seahawks last year. It wasn't an accident that he became one of the guys who was talking on the podium to the media every single week. I mean, they did really want to throw a little bit more of that kind of face of the franchise responsibility onto him. Not that necessarily talking to the media is that big of a deal, but that's the kind of thing they
sure, it's still the face you're putting on the game.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing they had. Bobby Wagner had done that for years, and some of the other guys, Richard Sherman did. During his last few years with the Seahawks, he was one of those guys. They always kind of spotlighted in that way, and so they wanted DK to take on more of that last year and become more of that kind of leader. Receiver is always a little bit of a tricky spot to be kind of that just position wise, I guess. That just kind of it's. I don't know how to say that, but you always feel like on offense your leaders are much more your quarterbacks, and there's always going to be a leader of the offensive line, and so you really need somebody to kind of step to the fore there and be the leader of that group as well. I mean, those are really important kind of things that way. But for sure, yeah, they want DK to take on more of that. And I think you saw him do that last year. It felt like there was I think he was really trying to do that a lot more last year and become that. And then Jordan Brooks, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, he's another guy. I think they really do want to become that. I think they felt like he was starting to assert himself a lot more last year. Then obviously the injury he had is kind of throwing a wrench into that. So right now it's just him sort of getting back on the field. And so the unfortunate part there will be that he's probably not going to be ready for the start of training camp. I would imagine he probably starts the year on the PUP list, and they kind of make sure he gets healthy. That's the whole 95% of the reason for bringing back Bobby was to have a hedge there for Jordan and not having to rush him back. So that'll make that a little bit trickier there from that standpoint. But I think they feel like he has that in him to be that kind of guy for sure. And hopefully he can get back on the field quickly this year and sort of get back to reasserting himself in that.
Yeah. And you would say you feel like he's earned the respect of his teammates in that regard?
Jordan Brooks? Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, he's until he got hurt, I mean, a tough guy who was dependable and been out there all the time. And, he hadn't yet become necessarily maybe the complete impact player that Bobby Wagner had been. His role did kind of change a little bit last year with some of the scheme stuff. I think he had to adjust to that a little bit. And, the most tangible thing he had to do was, he had to become that on-field play caller last year. And so even more so than leadership and sort of talking to the media way or whatever. I mean, that was really something he had to kind of take over, and he admitted there was some adjustment there and having to handle all of that, so that's I think from the team standpoint when they're looking at it even more so than maybe we would think of being a locker room leadership is he had to really kind of take that on last year, and I think they felt like he was. That's kind of a work in progress thing a little bit. It can be for guys. And so and as I say, I think Jordan admitted it a couple times that it was a little bit of an adjustment for him and something he had to learn how to handle along with simply playing on the field. But I think they felt like it's, that's still definitely in him for him to be that guy.
Sure. All right. One last question before we get out of here. You got to make a $10,000 bet on this. Okay, Bob?
Okay.
You are wagering $10,000. Whether the Seahawks go further this year than they did last year, don't go as far, or have the same result, losing the first round of the playoffs. Where are you laying that money?
Well, I mean, I'd go ahead and buy into the optimism and think they've got that they'll go further. There's some things that have to happen, obviously, and you can look at, they started 6-3 and they finished 9-8. So, which is sort of the real team? Is it the one that kind of stumbled down the stretch? And I guess it's easy to forget they lost at home to the Raiders, and had some.
Not easy to forget.
Yeah, maybe not.
That one hurt.
They weren't doing that in 2012. Let's say,
No, that's for sure.
So that's where there's reason to still be a little bit like, this team's got some proving to do. But I'd go ahead right now and drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and think they can do that. Just with the one thing, you look at the NFC West and they should have 4 wins there with the Rams and Cardinals. I know that. Then I know those games are tricky, especially the Rams. It almost doesn't matter what player is wearing a Rams jersey, that they're just going to give the Seahawks a tough time. But they've got some things like that I think maybe should allow them to get into a better spot going into the playoffs this year.
All right, guys, you heard it here. A $10,000 guarantee from Bob Condotta that the Seahawks are going further in the playoffs this year than they did last year.
Yeah, I'm leaving open the chance that I can revise this later in August.
No chance, buddy. No chance. We're writing it in cement.
Yeah, I mean, if some things don't happen or whatever.
Of course. Listen, Bob, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Sure. It's fun.
Yeah, man. I know covering the team keeps you busy, so it really does mean a lot that you carved out the time.
Sure. No, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Of course. And as we get out of here, where can the folks listening find more of your stuff?
Just the SeattleTimes.com, and I'm on Twitter, obviously at bcondotta, and on Twitter, and I always try to provide links to every story I do there. So at least if nothing else, you get the links there and all that. But yeah, that's just, again, SeattleTimes.com is obviously where all my stuff is.
All right, y'all, that does it for today. As for us, you can find Mike and I on social media as well. I am on Twitter at @JacksonBevins. That's JACSON. Mike is on Twitter at Mike Barwin, and the show itself is at Cigar Thoughts. You can also find us on Instagram at Cigar Thoughts NFL, on TikTok at Cigar Thoughts, on YouTube at Cigar Thoughts, and on Facebook at Cigar Thoughts, a football show. Of course, you can listen to this show and read every article at fieldgoals.com/Cigar Thoughts. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you like the show, drop us a 5-star rating and leave a quick review. Finally, be sure to check out cigarthoughtsnfl.com to get your exclusive Cigar Thoughts cigars, or hit me up on Twitter and I'll shoot you the deets. And when you buy those cigars, let us know on Twitter or Instagram with a pic and tell us what you think. Thank you to all of y'all listening for your continued support of the show. We know you've only got so much time for podcasts in your life, and it's an honor to be a part of that for y'all. Please know that by sharing this show on social media and with your friends, you give us the juice to keep making this happen. We will be back soon, but in the meantime, onwards and upwards, my friends.